All right, strap in for this deep dive. We're heading straight into true crime territory. You sent us some Wikipedia articles on Michael Cox, a serial killer convicted back in the 80s in California. So clearly you're into the dark side of humanity. And you want to go deeper with this case. I get it. So we're talking El Dorado National Forest, a killer with a pretty scary nickname and a string of murders that really shook a community.
Yeah, and what's really disturbing and fascinating about this case is that it's not just a straightforward monster in the shadows kind of thing. Michael Cox, he had a history, and it was a complicated one. And to really get his crimes, we need to start there.
Yeah, he was born in 56, the oldest of 7 kids. You can already kind of picture that environment, right? And the sources make it even worse. Parents split before he's even born, a stepfather who's probably abusive. It's like the setup for a disaster.
And that's what makes this case so interesting to think about, right?
Yeah.
Because we know that childhood trauma can play a big role in the lives of people who commit violent crimes. Now, it's super important to remember that it's never an excuse. But understanding those early experiences, it can give us a window into what might lead someone to do something so horrible.
And it's almost like we see that happening in Cox's life. At 13, he molests a boy in his neighborhood. His family has to move.
Yeah.
But then, and this is where it gets weird, he also saves his mom and brother from a really bad car crash. It's like he's heroic and horrifying at the same time.
It's a strange mix, right? You see these moments of empathy, even courage, but then he does these awful things. It makes you wonder, was it really him being selfless? Or was it a way to manipulate people to seem normal? Maybe it was both.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle, but the pieces don't fit right. Then you add in epilepsy and a growing problem with alcohol, and you've got a young guy clearly fighting some serious demons.
Exactly. And those struggles, they probably just made the trauma worse. This isn't about making excuses for what he did, but trying to see how all these factors came together to create this downward spiral. After high school, Cox joined a youth forestry conservation crew. And get this is where he meets some of his victims. And that's where El Dorado National Forest becomes part of the story.
That's right. He got the nickname the Forest Killer because he used his knowledge of the forest, from his time on that crew, to hide the bodies. And between June and August of '84, he murdered 3 teenage girls, Denise Galston, Linda Burrell, and Debbie Galston, who was actually Denise's twin sister.
The fact that he used the forest as his hunting ground and his burial site, it's really telling. Was it just convenient, or did he have a deeper connection to it, something psychological? Did it represent power or control for him? These are the kind of questions forensic psychologists try to figure out when they're trying to understand what drives a serial killer.
Yeah, and think about the first victim, Denise Galston. He tricked her into his car by saying there was a party. Another girl, Joanna Napolitano, was with her, and she barely got away. But imagine how scared she must have been knowing what she knew. It's no wonder she didn't want to talk about it at first.
Yeah, you can't underestimate the effect of an experience like that. For Napolitano, talking about it would mean reliving that terror. Maybe people wouldn't believe her, maybe he would come after her. It's a harsh reminder that for a lot of victims, coming forward is really hard. And sometimes it feels impossible.
Yeah, it's scary to think he probably used that charm to, trick his victims. And sadly, his next victim, Linda Burrell, she met him at a club. He kidnapped her, took her somewhere isolated, and, well, you can guess what happened.
And this is where you start to see a pattern forming.
Right.
Using social settings, tricking people, isolating the victims. These are all classic signs of a predator, someone who carefully picks and controls their targets.
And a few weeks later, he goes after Denise's twin sister, Debbie Galston. She's walking to a party, then she's gone. And they eventually find her remains near an oil rig. It makes you wonder if there was something specific about twins that he was drawn to.
That's definitely something investigators would have looked into. Was it random? Or did the fact that they were twins mean something to Cox? Maybe it was a way for him to feel even more powerful, to double the impact of his crimes. It's a disturbing thought for sure, but it gets at that twisted psychology of a serial killer.
And by this point, everyone's freaking out, right? They're finding these young women's bodies, and the community is terrified. They know there's a serial killer out there.
Yeah, imagine what it was like in Placerville back then. Fear, suspicion, everyone feeling vulnerable. It must have been intense. Parents wouldn't let their kids go anywhere alone, and every stranger was a potential threat. It's a reminder of how quickly things can change, how that feeling of safety can just disappear.
And get this, when they first started investigating, they actually interviewed Cox as a suspect.
That's right. And he managed to throw them off the scent. He probably used that whole act of being normal that we talked about before. It shows how these predators can blend in, it makes it so much harder to catch them. It's all about being cunning and manipulative.
But thankfully, Joanna Napolitano, the girl who escaped, remember her, she finally decides to tell her story, and that leads to Cox's arrest on November 10th, 1984.
Her bravery was so important it broke the case open, and when they searched his car, they found a gun, handcuffs, a knife, the tools of a predator. It confirmed what they were starting to realize about Cox, that he was driven by these dark urges.
So they charge him with 3 counts of murder, and of course he pleads not guilty.
Yeah, that's what they usually do. But the evidence against Cox was overwhelming. I mean, they had him dead to rights. The trial in July '85, it laid out all the horrible details of what he did, the lives he took, the terror he caused.
When it came to sentencing, his lawyers tried to use his rough childhood, the abuse he went through, as a reason to go easy on him. They were hoping to get the jury to vote against the death penalty.
And that's where you hit one of the toughest parts of the justice system, right? How much should someone's past matter? Can a terrible childhood ever justify doing something so brutal? There are no simple answers. And every case makes us face these really tough questions.
And in Cox's case, the jury decided to sentence him to death. He's been on death row at San Quentin ever since.
It just shows how serious his crimes were and the impact they had on the community, the families of the victims. It reflects that struggle we have as a society to balance justice, punishment, and the possibility of rehabilitation, especially in cases as messed up as this one.
Wow, we really went deep on this one, huh? Michael Cox, the forest killer. It's a story that leaves you with more questions than answers, that's for sure.
It really does make you think about human nature, doesn't it? How someone can be capable of good and evil, and it makes you face those tough realities, violence, trauma, and the consequences of these terrible acts.
You know what got to me? It's how his actions were so different. On the one hand, you have these planned, brutal murders, and then he goes and rescues his family from that car crash. It's hard to understand how those two sides could exist in the same person.
And that's what makes these cases so interesting and so hard to figure out. We're drawn to the darkness, trying to make sense of it, trying to find an explanation for the unexplainable. But sometimes there just aren't any easy answers.
And we can't forget the victims, 3 young women. Their lives were cut short. Their futures were stolen from them. It's a reminder that these aren't just stories. We're talking about real tragedies with real people who were hurt.
Exactly. Denise, Linda, Debbie. Their stories need to be remembered. They weren't just victims. They were individuals with their own lives, their own hopes and dreams, and their families and friends who were left behind dealing with this incredible loss.
So where do we go from here? What can we learn from this deep dive into Michael Cox and his crimes?
I think it challenges us to look deeper, to think about the things that lead to these cycles of violence, childhood trauma, the pressures of society, mental health. These are all pieces of the puzzle, and we need to understand them better if we want to stop this from happening again.
And it makes us ask those hard questions, right?
Yeah.
About the death penalty, about whether our justice system really works, about how we react to violence and trauma.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Here's something to think about. Could something have been done to help Cox before he got to this point? Were there chances to deal with his trauma, to give him support, to maybe change the direction his life was going? It's a question that comes up in a lot of these cases. It reminds us that preventing these things is just as important as punishing them.
It really is a lot to think about. And I'm sure you, our listener, will be thinking about these things long after this deep dive is over. Thanks for joining us as we explore this dark part of human history.